Hi everybody. Yeah, as I mentioned, as Siva and Ben mentioned, my name is Quentin G. I'm a manager of the Advanced Electrification Analysis branch at the Energy Commission in the division that Siva oversees. So in a way, Siva is my boss, but it's weird because he's a commissioner and it's a little different. But yeah, I'm a branch manager along with another branch manager. So we have two branches that manage the forecast. We kind of have the base element of the forecast, which is kind of like people use ACs in the summertime, right? The commercial development grows, industrial development grows. There's all that stuff. And then I manage the Advanced Electrification Analysis branch, which is like, oh, hold on a second. 10 years ago, how many people were worried about electric cars, right? How many people were talking about heat pumps 10 years ago, right? How many people were like really jazzed about efficiency? Oh, the Energy Commission's always been jazzed about efficiency. You know, we're really, there's a lot of new changes on the horizon, and that's where the Advanced Electrification Analysis branch comes in. So anyway, that's kind of enough about me. About 40 people total, about 20 people in my branch and 20 people in the demand analysis branch.
And there are many of these folks are open for internships and graduating.
Oh, yeah. We hired.
Starting this summer.
Yeah.
That is now.
Yeah. When you see the slides, I gave a copy to Alan here. You can refer to this slide if you ever like, what is on this? What's on these slides? We are an alphabet soup agency, like every agency out there. We'll go ahead and skip that. I'll try to talk about it as it, I'm not going to I'm going to try to avoid acronyms. Overall, I'm going to talk about the forecast. I'm going to talk about a little bit about what we call the demand scenarios, kind of like what Siva was getting into. Demand scenarios are a little longer term. I'm going to talk about some key forecasting concepts and then some issues, challenges, things to keep in mind when it comes to energy demand. And the starting point, I guess the starting point we might say is energy policy, right? But there's also energy demand. It's just people need energy. And once you find out what people need or what they're going to demand, then you can try to build out the system there. So demand, you might say, is kind of the starting point. There's obviously a push and pull between demand and supply. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I do the forecast along with a group of 40 talented forecast folks.
All statisticians and economists.
Statisticians, economists,
data scientists.
Yeah, coders, yeah, data scientists, policy people, and all across the board. Engineers.
And this is the only time I'm going to interrupt. So the day, at least through your presentation. In 2017, when I started there, the first person I met was already there for 41 years, forecasting. Right, so it's incredible talent. Dedicated people, don't make a lot of money. They could kind of probably have better jobs, but just committed to the cause and the idea of public service. So just incredible competence and experience.
Yeah, I think what motivates a lot of the staff is that they're helping solve the climate challenge, right? there's something great about that we're all driven by. I'm sure a lot of you are probably driven by that as well. That's why you're in grad school. Okay, so here's a brief outline. We'll talk about all this later on. You can refer back to this when the slides are posted. But let me talk a little bit about the energy demand forecast. We've got a broad approach across different economic sectors. We break up into about 6 different economic sectors: ag, residential, commercial. TCU is transportation, kind of like utility type transportation, like subways and things like that. So what they call transportation, communications, and utilities. So, different things associated with, traffic lights, satellites and other stuff that supports the grid and the utility system out there. Then we have transportation, mostly kind of like more in the on-road vehicle sort of space, as opposed to like subway cars and the, trolleys and things like that. And then we have industrial, and that's going to include petroleum, which is still a large component of our energy demand in the state, although we expect that to go down quite a bit, the petroleum part. We evaluate multiple fuels in the forecast. We primarily, we're here talking about electricity today, but we also look at natural gas. There's some impact between the IPER, the Integrated Energy Policy Report, and natural gas, kind of some challenges about aligning those. which you might talk about later on. We do petroleum demand. This is another key issue that Siva and I have been, and a whole bunch of other people in a different part of the division have been puzzled with because of price spikes and other things. You ever seen gasoline hit $6.50 a gallon or something, and then we've been asked a lot of questions about why is that happening and what's going to happen as demand declines. We expect demand to decline. In a captive market, declining demand doesn't necessarily mean declining prices, right? So that's a big challenge here, right? If it was just like people don't want microwaves anymore, it's just like, okay, well then you're just trying to sell all of your last microwaves, right? But people need gasoline. Some people are locked into that. And so those folks, as the demand declines, we have to think about that challenge as well. We also think about hydrogen, talk about this a little bit more. A lot of uncertainties around hydrogen, but definitely a fuel to keep an eye on. And then propane. Not so big, but there are a lot of propane users out there. If you know anyone that lives up in like the woods or whatever, they've got a big tank out there. They don't have a natural gas line going to their house, and so they're dependent on propane. We do a 15-year outlook. We used to do a 10-year outlook on the forecast. A new law was passed that CEC needs to look 15 years out, which is an extension of the forecast, more uncertainty, right? It's hard to know the further you get out. And then also the IPER and the energy demand forecast overall, these are very seriously vetted. This is not just kind of like, we finished it and we just throw it out the door. It's a very complicated process. It's a public process where there's a docket that's created for every IPER, and then, if something gets posted to that docket, that's there in perpetuity. Even that, like, if there's an error on the slides, we have to, you can't take it down. You have to say, oh, a new thing, this replaces this other thing, ignore it. But, that's still there in perpetuity. People post public comments, utilities might, have a complaint about something that has to go on to that public docket, and anyone in the public can see that. We also have a demand analysis working group. This is sort of a group of technical experts, a lot of our forecasting staff, and then a lot of interested folks that want to get on board and learn more about new forecasting tools that we have. And then we also have the Joint Agency Steering Committee. This is a group of key decision makers in CARB, at the CEC, in CAISO, and at the CEC, California Energy Commission, California Public Utilities Commission, California Air Resources Board, and California Independent System Operators. So they all kind of get together and they say, okay, you want to make this big change in the forecast this year, you got to run it by Siva, Brajinder.
I just always say yes. No, I'm just
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of different processes involved. There's one that's kind of like, these public workshops where we talk through things. There's these smaller, more technical things that might be a little less interesting. But the public's welcome on those. And then we have internal deliberations and discussions as well. Okay, so where do we use the demand forecast? As mentioned before, IRP, Integrated Resource Planning, we're trying to suss out how many power plants are we going to need? How many contracts do we need to get set up in the future? The transmission planning process, this is like the big, huge power lines that you see going down the 5. You've got to sort of figure out how to expand those, how to make that connection to then the distribution planning process, where you're talking about local substations. Before I came to the Energy Commission, before I had this job, I didn't even think twice when I walked by a substation. And now I'm on substation alert. I'm just everywhere I go, I'm looking at substations. They kind of look like that a little bit, but you see like a fence with all these wires and stuff coming out. That's a substation. And that goes into people's homes and into cities all over the place. So it's used in these different planning efforts. As Siva mentioned, there's also the resource adequacy component there, and a few other areas where there's some impacts. We also have long-term energy demand scenarios, like I mentioned. We'll talk a little bit more about those, but that's a key input for demand into SB 100. And then also, as I mentioned, the petroleum transition. We're going away from gasoline. We're going away from diesel. I don't know about jet fuel, but that's an interesting dynamic, right? Refineries you can't turn gasoline into jet fuel so easily, right? So a barrel of oil, gotta think about this, right? So much is gasoline, so much is diesel. What are you gonna do? Where are you gonna get your jet fuel from? So something for us to think about as well. So the forecast plays a role in all those different areas. We also have longer term energy demand scenarios. I kind of talked about these. These go out to 2050. At some point, we're going to have to kick them to 2055 because time's passing. It extends the forecast, but also considers new scenarios that add policies, maybe other technological factors for consideration that could impact energy demand. We're thinking about hydrogen, the energy demand scenarios. We're thinking about like, well, how would a pipeline for hydrogen look, right? So sort of asking some big questions about that and thinking about how energy demand could work there. And yeah, they're used in various long-term planning efforts. Like I mentioned, Senate Bill 100. Passed in 2018. Here we got a photo of then Governor Brown signing this to great fanfare. The first state, 100% zero carbon energy retail sales. There's still some wiggle room with self-generation and things like that. But 100% retail sales by 2045 of zero carbon. You'll notice that's a little bit of a different term than renewable energy or renewable electricity. In theory, you could have nuclear as well.
What does retail mean? Retail sales?
Retail sales. That's basically any old standard customer that you would have compared to maybe you've got an industrial site and they've got their own little generator that they're running. That's not counted in SB 100. So if you've got like a 10 megawatt generator for something that you're a big industrial plant, you're not counted there. If you've got a backup generator at home or a small business has a backup generator, those aren't necessarily included in this requirement here.
So I think, anything that an LSE, so basically a PG&E or somebody sells at the end of the day to the customer would be the retail sales.
That's virtually all.
Yeah.
But here's kind of how it is for this SB 100. If you think about what's being sold at the end of the kind of at a consumer, from the generator, it has to pass over transmission. And you're losing from this point to this point, you're losing about 6%. That does not have to be zero carbon, right? So my overall generation in the state is say less 100, only 95% of that ends up being retail sales that you're actually selling. About 6 or 7% is lost in transmission. And basically what this law does in a backhanded way allows us to only plan for 95%. We don't have to plan 100% of the generation to be clean energy or zero carbon.
Unless we make the transmission more efficient.
Unless you make transmission, or if it becomes less transmission and more local grids, then you begin to see like, okay, I don't have these losses. What do I do? So
it actually increases your the challenge.
requirement.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a huge point of contention in the SB 100. So just if I can add there, like there are multiple goals within California. If you look at scoping plan and its requirement on GHG emissions, it's much more stringent than clean energy, because what CARB is asking for from the electric grid is much less GHG emissions than this allows you to. So yeah, because you're allowing 6 or 7% of generation.
And part of that report, part of that discussion, there is a Senate Bill 100 report that has to be done. The first one was done in 2020, completed in 2021, and every 4 years thereafter. So we've got a Senate Bill 100 report coming up that we're working on right now. And so one of the things is that it requires a lot of analysis and thinking through lots of different policy discussions on it. But one of those is the input for that. It's going to be our long-term demand scenarios, which are based on the way that we forecast out. So here's some key forecasting concepts. I've heard some of these things maybe mentioned already, but we'll talk about some of these. There's planning areas. Siva showed you a map. I've got a map. Annual demand is one thing, kind of like how many gigawatt hours or terawatt hours or whatever term. So that's power times time is energy. So gigawatt hour, terawatt hour, how much of that are we going to need? Then we need to think about hourly demand. How much is demanded at every single hour of the year? And that leads us to a load profile, or what we call either a single day load profile, which is a common thing, or then there's what we call an 8760, 365 times 24, 8760. We ignore leap years. I guess that'd be an 8784, but that's not as easy to say, I guess. We think about system peak, and we think about another concept here is load modifiers. These are some of the big terms, and I'll go through the discussion of these here. We've got the electricity system planning areas here on a map. We've seen this map roughly before. I simplified it a bit, but we've got big PG&E territory, as mentioned. There's a bunch of CCAs, there's a bunch of publicly owned utilities, so community choice aggregators, publicly owned utilities that are in there, but PG&E kind of manages a lot of that distribution and some of the transmission in there. SoCal Edison as well, San Diego Gas and Electricity. These are investor-owned utilities. Their goal is to make money for their shareholders. And then we also have these NCNC is the non-CAISO Northern California area. So that's not a part of the three big utilities, but it's part of Northern California. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. We've got what we call Bugle, sometimes or Burbank, Glendale, and then the Imperial Irrigation District down there at 7. So there's 7 major planning areas. We break this up further into 20 different what we call forecasting zones. So PG&E, I believe, has 6 forecasting zones. I think SoCal Edison, blanking, maybe 5 or 6. So some of the big areas are broken up into smaller zones that are somewhat informed by things like climate and other planning considerations.
So I have a very quick question. Usually, so how does the area be divided? Like, like how do they decide like PG is in like this kind of area, this map, and the SDG is this map? Like who decide this? I'm just
That's a good history question that I don't have a good answer to. But that's why does it turn out that way?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think one interesting thing is LADWP's got a little section up there in the Sierras. So yeah.
Sorry, I have a separate question. So then what about the non-parts of California that like?
Yeah, so
darker
it's hard to see the gray versus the brown of IID, but up in that area there, we don't map that. That's kind of, there's a couple utilities up there that are covered with some Oregon areas, and they're maybe not necessarily big planning areas that we're looking at, but maybe they're tied into California somehow.
Its specific code is up there. So it kind of goes in California, Utah, and also Oregon.
Yeah, so presumably there's some kind of geographical, maybe topography sort of reason why these work out the way they do, but yeah, I don't have an answer to that history question.
It's history that originally every little community had its own utility. And then some capitalists basically got in and started buying them and combining them. And so that's how they grew to this size. And sometimes you have mistakes, like in Japan, one part of Japan was developed mainly by the German generation technology and the other by the American. And so half of Japan remains 50 hertz and the other is 60 hertz. And so they can't talk to each other. So you could imagine where Southern California it can't ship power to Northern California. That's what happens in Japan.
Yeah. Fortunately, we don't have that problem. That would be really rough for us. Texas. Yeah. Okay, so here's a way to think of another concept, annual demand. I just grabbed a chart here that I used somewhere else that splits out electric vehicles from this, but you can see like basically from, if you look at 2000, maybe I should have included the history. If you look at like 2000 to now, it's more or less flat, maybe a little bit of growth. And then now we're seeing this really large expansion of growth that we're seeing into the future, approaching 400 terawatt hours. And this is just in the CAISO area. That's just your PG&E, SoCal Edison, SDG&E area. Quite a bit of light duty, medium duty electric demand, but also important to think about that is the light duty EVs there, 2040, they're making up a large chunk of the electricity demand. We're talking on the order of like, 35 million cars, right? So when people say, is there enough power on the electricity grid? Maybe not today to meet what is gonna happen tomorrow, but we know what we're gonna need tomorrow. And so we can plan to that.
How much of the demand for EVs is actually meant from behind the meter sold?
I actually had to delete a little caption there from a previous presentation that I pointed out. Actually, this assumes that all of the EV charging is managed upfront. So the behind the meter solar it takes away from the energy demand that you see here. So we're actually consuming more energy than this, but we just kind of take it off the top and we're not trying to separate
This is,
that out.
yeah, that's an important distinction, right? Like, so, and I think Quentin will go into it. This is where the load modifying part comes in. So you're looking at, when you do the system planning, when I send my forecast to PG&E, I have to send it to them after you deduct all the behind the meter, right? Removal. So this is kind of what we call the managed forecast, which already deducts that. But if you're just thinking about what my consumption is, it's going to be significantly higher than that.
Yeah. I think I saw.
So, a couple questions. So you're projecting for the whole state, not just CAISO, right?
The IPER does, for transportation, it does. We also, the demand scenarios look at the entire state, or at least those sections, those planning areas that I listed out, which is more than CAISO. We're not necessarily forecasting for their planning processes. So where IRP and where TPP, the transmission planning and distribution planning go, the IPER primarily impacts those investor-owned utility areas.
So we have a statewide forecast, but the scrutiny really is on CAISO footprint, where these products are essentially mandated to be the input. The others, like publicly owned utilities, generally the state's relationship is a lot more handshake rather than telling them what. So with POUs, they tend not to, they have their own forecasts. We check in with them, but not force them.
Yeah. And CAISO represents, I think, on the order of 90% of electricity sold. Maybe it's a little less than that, but yeah, so it's the vast majority of it.
All right. Excuse me. And maybe I'm jumping ahead, but when you put this up, going up, I've been thinking about this. So the new projection for the state population through 2060 is flat and declining. Flat, right?
Yeah.
And we've been getting more energy efficient all the time.
Yeah.
So are your long range projections going down? Not up?
They're actually going up, but the reason why has to do in part with the electric vehicles you can see there, right? Because if we didn't have electric vehicles, you'd just have the blue part.
Well, what I mean is that overall energy, right, should be going down, right? There might be less gasoline, less fuel, and more electricity, but the overall energy, it decreased between 2020 or 2000 and 2020 when population was growing.
Right.
Now we're going flat. Isn't this making
So-
your life easier? Is that everything should be going down instead of up?
Yeah, so two observations. I think this is specifically electricity, right?
Yeah.
So the electricity per capita, as you mentioned, has been flat. What we're trying to do is we want to move away from a single chart like this to more capturing petroleum, natural gas, and electricity BTU. And I think then you will begin to see a downward. But I think one source, electricity, will probably go up for a while.
Electric, that's what I mean. There might be fuel switch, but in general, the state energy use should be going down.
Yeah, that's true. If you were to look at every joule
And even
of energy.
this, even though the EVs are coming up, we're just getting more efficient all the time, right? So that should be driving down. We shouldn't be projecting.
I mean, I'll pass it to you, Ryan. The
projecting
only
much
thing I
growth.
would say is we might still have industrial growth in California. Hopefully we'll attract some manufacturing. And one of the key inputs into forecasting is climate. And then another key input is economic and demographic variables.
Yes.
We have more population, data centers, hydrogen. Those things begin to so hydrogen alone, if we take the most optimistic projections of hydrogen, it alone will need 25 gigawatts of energy, of capacity to have electrolytic hydrogen. So those are the new things. I think as a residential base, as a commercial base, maybe will flatten or go down, but as an industrial and other use cases come in, it probably will go up still.
I was gonna ask as well, the increase in load, my guess would be from the assumptions of electrification of much of our
Yeah.
natural gas system over the next 30
Yeah.
years, which would, I mean, that seems like underestimated,
Yeah,
just in my opinion, but like.
yeah, what I pulled out, what I highlighted here, I just so happened to highlight electric vehicles, but also in that blue load that you see growing is climate change from more energy demand from climate change. Also more heat pumps and other forms of electrification, right? So we're not counting the natural gas. This is just electricity. So we're not looking at the natural gas. We're not looking at the petroleum, either the BTUs or joules of that. We do go down quite a bit if you want to look at like primary energy or fundamental energy and like measured in joules. One reason is because on-road vehicles are about 3 times, you can get about 3 times the distance using electricity. A joule of electricity will give you 3 times the distance as a joule of gasoline or petroleum or something like that. Just electricity is much more refined. You can think of just like the waste heat that comes off an engine. You don't have that with electric vehicles.
Right.
Yeah.
Which,
And this is a question that Jaden's going to ask, so, what about data centers?
It's there.
One thing about this, yes.
it's gonna come in. So can we just kind of jump in? So we're about 7. So I don't know how much time you have, and then I don't know how much time presentation. Are you thinking about?
Presentation.
Okay.
Presentation, he says.
Okay.
He's presenting himself.
Okay. So I want to just make sure like
I'll
you
try
have time
to-
to presentation, and then we have like a conversation on the perils of demand forecast being wrong and the issues it creates for you downstream.
Yeah. So I'll do what I can to keep it at 15 more minutes or so. Yeah.
Let's try to stop you.
Great. Okay, some other concepts related to forecasting is the hourly demand, or what we call a load profile that represents the hourly demand, and then system peak. So one way to kind of imagine this is, load on the grid is in blue here, an hour of the day, starting 12 a.m. to 12 a.m. And you can sort of see, like, basically that I grabbed like an example summer day. You can see, 5, 6 p.m. That's when people get home, ACs are cranking, et cetera. It doesn't look like this every day of the year, right? This is summer. This is when some parts of the state are feeling 105 or 110. The March doesn't look the same. I'll talk a little bit about that. Winter is not going to look the same. But one thing to keep in mind is, all those wires that are running through the system, those big, huge transmission lines, they need to be built for that at least, right? So March, February, whatever, those other months, you don't need, you have this kind of underused capacity here. You have to get to that, and every hour that you're not at that, you've got slack, right? Or headroom, you might say. Some other concepts, load modifiers, as I mentioned before, kind of talking about advanced electrification. Some contributions to electricity demand are growing quickly, heavily influenced by state policy, maybe influenced by a lot of other things around technological development, but just kind of not necessarily expected before at this rate. And we call those load modifiers. We have that baseline thing where we know people use ACs at 5 p.m. But now we have these other components here. Transportation electrification, as I mentioned, fuel substitution, primarily building electrification, where we're talking about heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, heat pump HVAC, induction stoves, those kinds of things. Efficiency policies that are out there. The state also has very stringent energy policies that are built into code and into appliances. We also have behind the meter solar and storage, right? That's going to impact demand. If your meter's going negative and you're putting power onto the grid, that impacts this load shape, right? And then also data centers are another recent one we got a lot of attention on lately. But let me go ahead and talk about some of these a little bit in turn. So climate change, integrating that into the forecast is going to be a bit of a challenge here. So here, what we have are on the y-axis are what we call cooling degree days. A cooling degree day is roughly sort of like, take the average temperature, let's say 68 degrees, it's kind of your average day. How many days times the degrees are you going above that? So if it's 98, right? You've now got 68 minus 98, so you've got like 30, every day like that adds 30 to this chart here. And so we can see over time that the cooling degree days have increased. This is going to put more pressure on the air conditioning demand, especially. And also, by contrast, on the flip side, maybe less of what we call heating degree days, which is sort of the inverse, but I'm not going to show that here. The forecast used to kind of just use a flat line, kind of like this blue line here that you see. They made an adjustment to kind of get to the orange line to kind of say, whoa, things have changed actually in recent years. We can't use the 30-year average. And we've actually brought in some contractors that helped us sort out actually that we can expect this to actually grow. So more AC demand, more people, more air conditioning and more use of the air conditioning that is purchased, right? So we have to figure that into the forecast.
Can I just say one specific limitation for a public process like CEC is we cannot use any data that's not publicly available. So that's a limitation of a public process. We can't say, hey, we had a black box idea, and here you go, this is really good, trust us, right? So what happens is it inherently creates a lot of limitation. For example, we might have a really good data source, but we can't buy it because it's too expensive. Or, even if we buy it, we can't share it with anybody else, just trust us. So because of those limitations, sometimes what we have to do is we have to find this patchwork options because that's part of, respecting the public process and making sure everybody understands what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So integrating that in, the impact here, I think this is KISO planning, just the climate change. So this is the additional AC load, other types of effects there. You can see that we're looking at 2023 at the bottom in the red, and then you look at a peak day all the way in 2040, and we've got an additional on the order of 700 megawatts just because of climate change, not because of, more people using the ACs, although that's kind of indirectly built in here because more people are using it, but just to satisfy those cooling degree days, we're going to see more load, especially at peak during this time period. And also at night, people do run their ACs at night. There's not as much pressure on the AC, but they still do operate the AC at night.
Do we get copies of these slides?
Yeah.
Alan's going to post them at some point.
All the students have it, Kelly, not you.
We gotta add it to the canvas.
Yeah. Another load modifier, I mentioned transportation. We saw that before. Oh boy, oops. My animations here were a little off. We've got a complicated transportation forecast, a team of about 8 folks that work on the transportation forecast. We've got a baseline where we kind of just look at where the market's headed. And then we take a look at what we call the AATE, or the additional achievable transportation electrification that's driven by policy, where we have this criterion that we call reasonably expected to occur. We look at advanced policies like Advanced Clean Cars 2, which is a car policy that says, if you sell vehicles, you got to have these EV credits. How do you get an EV credit? Sell electric vehicles or sell a zero emission vehicle. You didn't sell enough, don't have enough credits, go to someone else that does have some credits, like Rivian, right? Or Tesla or some other company there that all they make are electric cars. They're going to generate credits. And if you're behind, maybe you're some company I'm not going to name or whatever, and you kind of have your head in the sand about transitioning, you're going to have to buy someone else's credits. And the ramp up there is that by 2035, all new cars that are sold, the used market can stay however it wants to, but all new cars that are sold are going to have to be zero emission.
Professor, I'm going to just kind of use my opportunity here. Is everybody tracking this as a trade-off? So the baseline forecast is our best understanding of what is reasonably going to occur in the market. But then, what Rajinder told us last time, in order to hit the scoping plan targets, you shall have this much electrification in transportation, right? That's a policy agenda. And now we're being kind of asked, hey, you know what? That policy agenda is really the truth, not the reasonable to occur that you're probably watching the market. So suddenly the Energy Commission, through a public process, has to decide to put the green one up there. As soon as you put the green one up there, Mitch loves it. He needs to now build the resources rapidly for that.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah, it's certainty, right? I mean, it boils down to certainty. So we're a community choice aggregator. We're a load serving entity in California. We serve Yolo County, parts of the UC Davis campus. I don't know if you all are familiar with that business model or not. But I just got back from our board meeting. We talked about the power charge difference adjustment, which is the PCIA, a lot of different kinds of things. But we were looking at forecasting, right? I mean, that was part of what we're trying to do is looking at the combination of the load forecasting and how that influences our financial forecasting. Because in the CCA model, my customers can leave. I don't have captive customers. And so it's a public entity, but it's this sort of modified kind of crazy thing that we've constructed, which is good, that allows customers a little bit of choice and they can leave and go back to the investor-owned utility. So when the forecasts come out of the CEC, that tells us, and unfortunately my slides aren't going to work, but it tells us what we have to go out and procure for, like the year ahead. I mean, it's more complicated than
We
that.
covered that a little bit.
Okay, so we're doing long-term power purchase agreements, 15, 20-year contracts. But that's all based on what our best guess is on the interpretation of what the CEC is putting out and what our local conditions are. So is there going to be a higher adoption, for example, of electric vehicles here in Yolo County than there is for the statewide forecast? Likely yes, because we have a pretty engaged customer base. Okay, that's fine. So we take that and we modify our case. We have some conversations with CEC and we say, okay, this is what we think it's going to be based on our local situation. Another one is this distributed resources. Here in Yolo County, as it turns out, we've got fantastic solar resource. We've got a motivated communities. They're doing a lot of rooftop solar. We have one of the highest penetration rates in the entire state. Here in Yolo County, about 20% of our customers are rooftop solar customers or NEM customers. That makes a difference in what that sort of forecast looks like for us. If I had access to my slides, I would put it up and it would show on a month-to-month basis, we actually track our forecast versus our actual, right? We need to know whether we should be hedging more, going out and getting more in the market, or whether we should be dialing that back. Is there a forecast too aggressive for us? We need to know that based on real conditions. And those real conditions end up being things like market conditions, but also weather conditions. We also have about 15% of our load here locally is in the agricultural sector. That means pumping water out of the ground. Takes a lot of energy to do that. If it's a good water year, the water table is higher. UC Davis helps us understand this. You don't have to use as much energy to pump the same amount of water. If it's a bad water year, we're spending a lot more money, or our customers are spending a lot more money. The forecast can be off. So it depends on sort of local conditions. And we're sort of, when it comes to the energy sector, VCE, we're a relatively small load serving entity. So it's sort of hyper local for us. It's not like PG&E that stretches from Oregon down to Bakersfield, right? It's not even like SMUD over in Sacramento. There's more stability generally as you get a little bit larger. You know, some of these things can sort of offset one another. So there's a lot of different factors that kind of come into this. The reality of what the CEC is talking about and thinking about and trying to forecast goes into sort of big statewide models, and then it gets filtered down to the actual implementation and the actual going out into the market and buying contracts and trying to forecast that. So it's as much art as science. It's probably more art than science. So I'm looking across the table at one of our wonderful regulators here in California, and it's the bane of our existence, regulators, because they have big ideas. They're being given direction to implement state policy. And then they say, okay, that's great. Let's put the green wedge on here. And oh, by the way, Mitch, now here's your green wedge. You have to figure out how to actually do it. I mean, they're supportive, they're helpful. You know, Siva, I would point out and elevate up as to being one of the regulators who's willing to sit down and listen and have these types of conversations. So those are important things, but at the end of the day, we have to figure out, okay, how are we going to implement that and be cost competitive? Because again, we don't have guaranteed cost recovery because our customers can leave. So we're, as a CCA, we're taking on all the risk that the investor-owned utilities don't have, because they are a monopoly. They're guaranteed, basically whatever they do, they get paid. It doesn't matter, right? Because their customers come and go. We were talking about this power charge and difference adjustment, PCIA. That means that my customers who have left the investor-owned utilities as generation customers and come over to us, they have to pay this PCIA, which basically compensates the investor-owned utilities for the stranded costs that they have invested in for these either long-term contracts or other resources like dams and nuclear power plants and things like that. So again, we're sort of in this interesting, dynamic, creative space as CCAs of trying to take state policy, put it into place while listening to my board of directors who are made up of local elected officials who have their own objectives that they're trying to do, whether it's, we have a goal of being 100% renewable, RPS eligible by 2030. That's a hard thing to do, but that's what our board has said we should try to shoot for. We're going to hit that by 2030. Whereas the state said you need to be 65% by 2030. So there's those sort of local goals that we're trying to balance too. And it's all very fun and very interesting. And I'm happy to report that we just gave a financial report to our board. We're actually doing pretty well in this year and next, and we're building our reserves. We just went through a public financing for our bonds. I haven't had a chance to tell you this yet, but got 14.4% savings on all of our long-term power purchase contracts, just because we are a public agency and have access to public funding. So that means every year our customers are saving another $2.5 to $3 million, which on a per bill basis, not a whole bunch, but overall, that's a really solid outcome. And for 10 years, we got that. So there's really kind of good outcomes. I don't know if any of that is relevant to what you're talking about.
Okay, can I just kind of take a moment and kind of harmonize? I think this is the perfect conversation we wanted to have. So last time we had Rajinder here and talked about the scoping plan and the impacts on, how scoping plan could be bane of our existence.
Yeah.
Right. So, and it kind of flows down. And I think the points that you just shared is exactly what we want this class to hear. Is there is a regulation, there is actual implementation in free markets, and you have to figure out, and then, the legislature, again, the democratic, forces. So you have the democratic force as your board.
Yep.
You have the state intervention from regulations, and then you need to actually make your business investable.
Yes.
So the forces cannot be more clear, and I think that's the whole class is about. It's kind of them understanding that there are trade-offs, and so they could become better leaders.
And one other thing I would add to that too, and just sort of tie together, we're not in opposition to our regulators. We are working towards the same objectives that the state has. And you've heard me say this before, but CCAs have filled a space that was unoccupied before. It was vacant. The investor-owned utilities, I won't say only answer to their investors, but that's their primary objective. No qualms with that. That's the way the system is set up. CCAs come into that space, and we're sort of the connective tissue between the implementation, the local action. That's how it happens in California, and where the state is at and trying to get to. We're supportive of those things, and we're created. That's part of our mission to try to accomplish that. So we're trying to figure out how we all sort of play productively and effectively together. And there are balances and there are trade-offs. So yeah, happy to answer questions or go anywhere you want to go
let's see.
with this.
Do you want to kind of continue the thread?
Yeah. The TE is, I think, a good example because there's a lot of
Yeah.
uncertainty. There's other areas too, and I'll show you here a little bit. So there's uncertainty here, I don't know if you've all heard, but there was an advanced clean fleets regulation that was passed by the Air Resources Board. They can't do that on their own. They have to go to the EPA and say, please. They withdrew that request because of, as we all know, we've got a different sort of policy agenda at the federal level, right? Other things, distribution challenges. If you look at an EV charging station, it's super spiky. There's no one there. And then all of a sudden it spikes up to a megawatt. And then the next hour it's down to 200 kilowatts. And then the next hour it's up to a megawatt. So there's lots of uncertainty there. Vehicle grid integration, just kind of like thinking about how can you get folks to charge smartly, et cetera. And then outside of electricity, as we mentioned before, there's the petroleum demand decline, which is another big problem. Sort of looking at the hourly profile. So again, kind of getting to the resource adequacy challenge, right? We have some confidence that people are going to be more likely to charge at night or maybe during the day. At 5 o'clock, that's when ACs are cranking. That's also when PG&E, maybe even your CCA will say, hey, you got to give us a little bit more per kilowatt hour than just what the normal rate is. So we have this sort of that other load, and then we have this kind of expectation of that baseline forecast and then that additional component there. Data centers, this is another area that's brand new. We got data from 5 utilities, integrated that into the forecast. We're talking about, on upwards of maybe 4 gigawatts, 4,000 megawatts by the time 2040 rolls around. There's uncertainty here because, what if some fancy new AI thing can generate, the same large language processing or whatever they do for AI? What if they can do that with half the computing power, right? Okay, well, they can do that, but now maybe you've got twice as much built now because of that, right? Because you want to have more. So there's that kind of, rebound effect question that we're dealing with. There's uncertainty here, but we are using applications to help inform that work there.
Can I just add on that one? So just noting that this 5 gig or 4.5 gig is taking kind of a percent of what these utilities are telling us, because we just don't have the confidence yet. So we had this year-long process of the Public Utilities Commission saying, no, don't bake that much, because we don't know, right? We don't know if you go to Nevada, if you go to Arizona, the same data centers are saying we're gonna build there, right? So our problem is, how do you know? How do you know where they're gonna build? And if I'm gonna start making these huge investments in distribution upgrades, will I have stranded assets, right? So there's still those open questions. But I think one of the things we're hearing is the forecast, even with the DeepSeek, right? Earlier this year, there was this idea initially that the DeepSeek will reduce the data at center need, but we just heard from both Google and Microsoft in some of our meetings that it's actually going to extend the need for data centers because they think there'll be more processing. So you're kind of trying to bake, and I want to just give you the scale of these things, right? Each of them is so big, the scale of them, and you're just putting them in there and say, oh, maybe.
Plan for this.
Yeah,
Well,
maybe we should plan for that.
let me add one thing to that too, to sort of ground truthing some of that. And I think that the discussion is exactly the right one. Everybody's being approached.
Yeah.
I've got a data center. I've got a data center. I'm gonna build one here, I'm gonna build one there, and sort of technically, they need to be located sort of in the right sort of place.
Latency issues.
And so there's a lot of discussion about how much of this is actually real. And whether or not you would do it in California, and whether or not you would do it in an investor-owned utility service territory where the rates are relatively high, not relatively, they're high.
Or you want to go to Texas?
Go to Texas, go to Nevada, go to SMUD.
Yeah.
Right? SMUD has rates that are half what PG&E is as a publicly owned utility. I mean, put that into your business model, right? I mean, it's not that complicated. So there's a lot of discussion about whether or not that's real and it's actually going to show up. And the other point here, and maybe you've talked about this previously, but the investor-owned utilities, the deal that they have with the state, being a monopoly, they get paid for infrastructure. So they want to build a bunch of stuff. They have incentive to build all this stuff out. So
They want to say 7 gigawatts.
They want to say 7. They want
Yeah.
to say as much as possible because that's what they're incented to do.
Yeah, we haven't actually talked about this. I mean, please go with that flow, and I think it'll be really helpful to maybe take a minute to explain the kind of the CCA revenue model versus an IOU, like an investor-owned utility, and I think it probably will benefit if you want to extend that.
Yeah, so I mean, we're public, we're nonprofit, we're essentially kind of municipal power light because we only deal with the generation side of the bill. The transmission and distribution side stays with the investor-owned utility, right? And so the generation side of the bill, if your utility is supposed to be a pass-through, I mean, by and large it is. I mean, for discussion purposes, let's say it's just a pass-through. So they don't get any profit on that side of the bill. That's the way that the state set it up in order to be able to incent. where they do get their guaranteed rate of return. I think it's 10, they're asking for 12 now,
It's 11 and a half, let's.
it's 11 and a half. So whatever they build, they get a guaranteed profit of excess of 10%. It's a great deal, okay?
So you
It's a
guys
really
are all
good deal.
tracking that, right? So everybody's tracking that, right?
And the reason for that, the history of that is that back when there was no electricity and no lines or anything like that, nobody was gonna invest in this sort of new technology, so you had to say to the utilities, we'll guarantee this for you, we'll give you the monopoly, we'll make sure you've got a profit. So you can go out and raise money to be able to do this. So there's a rationale for it. That was over 100 years ago. Whether or not that rationale still holds true, there's debate over that. But that's where they make their profit. So whenever you look at something like this, you can see where the incentives are to be able, from an investor-owned utility standpoint. And again, I don't begrudge it for them. That's the way the rules are set up, is to push as much of that cost into the transmission distribution side of the bill as possible. We as CCAs operate just on the generation side. And so we're looking at, again, customers can leave. We need to be able to pay our costs. So we're generally indexed to PG&E's generation rates. And so that means that right now we say, okay, we're going to charge our customers the same as PG&E, but give a 5% discount on the generation rate. That's what we're doing today, 10% for our lower income customers, because we've been able to sign these longer term contracts, put ourselves in a good position to be able to do that. PCIA has been favorable the last couple of years. We're headed towards an investment grade credit rating. We got this, this public financing thing that I've talked about before. So those are the kind of, does that get it?
No, I think it gets it. So let me kind of bring this to the
Sorry.
motivation of this class. Now I'll pass it to you, just motivation of the class. So as a public entity who are tasked with developing the forecast, as we talked about last week, and then just Mitch kind of raising this, much of what we do as a state, while it is done at a state level, the actual impacts are local and community level. So there's always going to be this tension of like, what is a good handoff point? So for example, for forecast, should we just do an annual and then just leave it there? Should we like do a little bit more, like 8760? Do we want to give a little bit more cushion? Do we want to hand it off at like a PG&E territory level? Or do we want to get all the way to the LSC? So these are the trade-offs, right? So like how far, where is the handoff? That's one. Two, let's just assume I'm sitting on the dais and I'm taking, Mitch comes in and makes a passionate 3-minute comment on why the forecast is wrong. And we're trying to figure that out. And I'm trying to give a good faith chance to everybody to talk. The incentives, as Mitch noted, PG&E, I'm not going to say good, bad, right? PG&E has an incentive, financial incentive, to err on the side of a bigger build, right? And PUC, as a rates regulator, we're more of a planning agency, but as a rates regulator, has an incentive to err on the side of lower bill. CAISO, as a system operator, has an incentive to err on the side of more build to keep the lights on. And we have to take all those points of view and say, we'll settle here. So that's kind of where it is for us. Sorry.
And so one last quick thing too. But the customers talk to me.
Yeah, they don't talk to me, yeah.
They don't talk to the regulators. They talk to the people that they can pick up the phone or come and knock on the door, things like that. So we're hearing that, trying to translate it up through the regulatory process so that they have a better understanding about what's sort of happening on the ground. Because what you don't want to see is a ratepayer revolt. Nobody wants to see that.
Can I just, before we
Yeah.
pass, can I just kind of, given that this whole class is about trade-offs and kind of having these discussions, could you, as a CCA representative, talk about how, I don't want to make it like a rhetorical question, more of, as you said, you don't have the guarantee for customer base.
Yeah.
Right? That means if one of the CCAs shut down for whatever reason, immediately PG&E or some other utility has to absorb that load, right?
Right.
And they have this whole issue of like, okay, you're gonna fold, now I have to kind of absorb that. Could you just kind of honestly, kind of from IOU perspective, share their concerns?
Yeah, so from the IOU's perspective, they have not bought for that load for some period of time, even though the PCIA is actually there, it's a backstop. So that's sort of the existing generation. And in some ways, again, this is more from a CCA perspective, but the resources exist, right? It's
But somebody's gonna contract them,
who owns them, who contracts with them, that kind of thing. So they're still out there to be able to serve the load. But from the IOU's perspective, they don't want to see that sort of sloshing back and forth, because then they have to go out back into the market if they can't get those contracts that are already serving those customers from the CCA who fails, assigned to them. They have to go back out. It's a administrative sort of headache for them. And more than that, I don't want to diminish it or minimize it, but that's a real issue. It's called the provider of last resort, or POLR. And it used to be a bigger deal when CCAs were newer, and there was less certainty about how successful they would be. We've only had one CCA that's sort of folded up shop, and that was because of mismanagement. And the statewide association of CCAs, Cal CCA, is very, very sort of in tune with that issue, because it causes issues for all of us. Because then it threatens this sort of business model. So that's why we're all out there trying to get investment grade credit ratings and building our reserves and things like that, to show that we're in this for 50 years, 100 years, or however long it's gonna, we're gonna sort of be in existence. So, again, I don't know.
That's a great point. I think that's kind of, those are the kind of things, if I had Public Utilities Commission here and their representative, they would strongly argue for that. At the end of the day, they have to figure out rate stability and certainty that the consumers have power. And they have only, I mean, they have some agency over the CCAs.
Yes.
But their real agency is over the investor-owned utilities, and the tool they have is what they want to use. Right?
Yeah, and they're trying to figure out how to, we're what, 10 years old, let's say, for CCAs.
And you're 50% of the load.
50% of the load in PG&E service territory, about a third of the load statewide. So it's a big deal. And then the publicly owned utilities are another 21%, something like that. So 70,
It's growing very fast.
Right.
Yeah, it's growing very fast.
So those things are sort of out there. But the last point I make on this too, though, is that we're incentivized as CCAs to be responsive to our customers, both in terms of reliability and cost, because our customers can leave. That is not the case when you have captive customers. Plain and simple. If you don't have to compete for them, you don't. And so that's led to a lot of the sort of construct that we have here in California with regard to how the energy sector sort of functions. And that's true of publicly owned utilities also. Palo Alto, SMUD, Roseville, just LADWP, their customers are captive. And so generally speaking, we CCAs have sort of found themselves in the position of now being sort of the real sort of customer advocates in California. Because these changes, these regulatory changes, we pay close attention to them, because if it shifts somebody's bill even by a little bit, it can be
lose a customer.
Yeah.
Sorry, there was a couple of questions. Yeah.
I just had a mechanical question, and if it takes too long to answer, I can take it offline, but you mentioned with the forecasts, you're having to decide how deep to go with the level of granularity, and then I'm curious if the process, it sounded like the process might be open to input from that, right? And so then there's maybe a discussion, like maybe that your organization might show up and say, this is where we see errors or where we want to see adjustments, and then I wonder if like the CCAs or the other LCs, then I'm imagining you do your own forecasting based off of the maybe state level ones, but you need to get to maybe more detail and more certainty within your local areas. I'm just curious if if that's true, if I'm understanding correctly.
But yeah, without getting too wonky, and we can kind of like go to this more. So the way the forecast is, so once the state is done, and then you have different territories that Quentin kind of talked about, and then you have sub LSCs underneath them, right? So what the Energy Commission asks for is basically their forecasts, right? And then those forecasts then are added up in terms of coincidence, right? Coincidence because of geographical, diversity, you need to make sure it's happening at the same hour across all of that geographical diversity. And then you bring them up, and the agreement is the statewide forecast, and then this built-up forecast should not be in more than a 1% error. And so that's the agreement. So there's a lot of back and forth that happens in making sure that it's done. But to Mitch's point, if you're big enough, the error's okay, right? But then the smaller they are, the errors could mean a lot on their financials because it's such a significant change for them.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, like to go through that, so when you're building up all of these forecasts and, each LSC has to have the adequate resources like procured to meet that. Is there any conversations with CAISO about like congestion as a result of like that resource adequacy? And is that included in this part of the forecast for that determines what you actually have to do in the state? I guess like how granular do those conversations get? And because that's a huge issue too on pricing.
Oh, you're absolutely right. So they do happen, but here's a convoluted issue. We have, I'll try to see if I can find a picture of a wall of swim lanes, what we call. So the problem is every forecast, let's just use the word vintage, right? I have a 2021 vintage of the forecast, 2022 vintage of the forecast. And those different vintages flow into different vintages of IRP, different vintages of resource adequacy, and different vintages of transmission planning and distribution planning. So the part of the issue is, by the time, if I'm starting forecast today, I am done in a year, and IRP might start with me, and IRP is a 3-year process. So by the time they're done, I have 2 forecasts. So they're already behind. And if I'm looking at resource adequacy, my forecast that I start, like let's say this is 2025, I finished my 2025 forecast in January of 2026. And the 2025 forecast that's done, let's call it the 2025 vintage, right? Because that's what I worked on. 2026 January, I'm done with that, and the state adopts that as the forecast. And that 2026 vintage forecast goes into 2027 resource adequacy planning. I'm already 2 years behind, right? And for some of them, it's like, it's no big deal. It's because they're big. Somebody like Mitch, like, dude, you had this much low off here. So that's the issue. So the vintage is a big issue. So there is coordination, but there has not been a breakthrough on harmonizing the vintages or agreement on outside process enhancements to make sure the latest is taken into, because everybody's like, this is my process, I have to run like 18 months on it. Sorry, I don't have time for it.
Sure.
Okay. Let's try to just run through, I've got a few more concepts and then some high level issues for us to like continue some of this good discussion that we're having. So fuel substitution, energy efficiency, this is another component. Basically, again, using that, we do have this additional achievable energy efficiency, additional achievable FS fuel substitution. So think of like another layer on top of the regular load that we're expecting.
Can you explain fuel substitution?
Yeah, that building electrification, basic, for all intents and purposes for this discussion, it's that. It could include hydrogen in the future if we've got some, hydrogen being used at industrial sites. But yeah, so it adds or efficiency takes away from load, fuel substitution adds to load. We include programs, incremental codes and standards. We also include CARB is considering a zero emission appliance standard. Basically, maybe you're not going to be able to buy a gas furnace, in a few years. That could add to the uncertainty there, depending on whether or not they'll be able to get that regulation to pass, or whether or not the federal government is going to come in and try to prevent that from happening. They offer a range of different scenarios from 1 to 6 with more aggressive savings and more aggressive fuel substitution. They usually grab the third one for that planning level, and then more for distribution thinking. They're like, well, maybe we're less energy efficient and more fuel substitution to account for more uncertainty that could occur, more load accounting for more uncertainty there. Okay, so then policy choices, thinking about some of these issues. Here's 4 issues that I think are kind of important for us to think about, like, what are we going to deal with, right? First thing, winter peaking, right? I mentioned heat pumps, fuel substitution. Okay, well, here you can look at the summer peak. So this is every year, like what is the peak value of that year? And you can see it's going up because more ACs, people are charging cars during the peak hour, some people are, et cetera. And so you can see that in yellow or orange, the September peak is going up a little bit, but you can see the winter peak in February, the peak of February, not a whole lot of people have heat pumps now, but then you're going to see more and more people buying heat pumps, and that's going to cause the winter peak to go up, actually leading to quite different load shapes. On the left-hand side, we're looking at February. So February in 2025 is down at the bottom there. You can see like that's what we're expecting this year, what happened this February. In 2045, up, right? Maybe this is 2040. I might have had a typo there, but then maybe this is 2040. I made a typo there, but 64 gigawatts in February, right? That's a risk. But if you look at the summer, it's you know, you've got a peak and you do go up quite a bit. You go up a good amount here from here to here, but it's not quite as big as this jump that you're seeing here. So February is an issue, winter peaking, right? Solar, and you know, supply folks are going to have to think about this. How much solar is there in February compared to September, right? So those sorts of questions.
Can I also add just on that one? I think this is such an important one from a policy point of view. We've been talking about this a lot at the administration level. I think I want to just point that, you know, given that it's happening at 7, the resource mix we need to plan for is very different, right? Like think about wind profiles. You know, when is wind going to come? When's wind's going to end? When's solar going to come and not? And before, when we're putting storage, I'm like, oh yeah, you know, I need storage just as the sun goes down and the wind picks up. I have a little bit of time. Now I need it in the morning and in the evening. So I need to charge it twice. So if I'm charging it twice, it's not only a capacity issue, which is a peak issue, it's also an energy issue. Do I have enough energy on the system to charge my batteries twice? Or do I have to like have 2 stacks of batteries? Go ahead.
Well, okay, if this is caused by a winter peak, wouldn't you expect the afternoon peak in the winter to be a lot lower? Like, so
Yeah.
why would you still expect 2 spikes a day?
Because the solar is low, right? So the thing that we need to think about is not just, this is what we call a gross peak, right? And what we call a net peak, I'm sorry, I'm introducing a new item here. Take the gross peak on the system and remove all the solar and wind out of it. Suddenly this one becomes 2 spikes. And those 2 spikes have to be met with a resource that can firmly follow the frequency needs up and down.
Yep.
But that time also the afternoon coincides with when commercial power demand is beginning to decline, but still large, and residential is picking up. And so it's a coincidence. Just
Do you want to do it now?
No, I don't want to do it over.
Cool. Yeah, and then another challenge here, lots of behind the meter solar. One of the things we found in our demand scenarios, negative minimum load. So here we can see in the SoCal Edison territory, here's your winter peak, here's your summer peak. These look like kind of like what we were thinking about before. Here is your March day here, dipping down below 0. Not because of the solar out in the deserts, but because of solar on people's rooftops. There's more we're intercepting enough from the homes and the small businesses or whatever at those rooftops behind the meter and their energy demand isn't very high in March, right? Because it's sunny, but there's not a whole lot of AC going on at that point in time. So this thing, huge challenges here potentially for distribution. We don't know what happens when there's so many people on a circuit or so many people connected to the same substation and that drops down to zero, we don't know how to, we gotta start thinking about that, right? We got time, but we do have to start thinking
Can
about it.
I just add, so just think about also just a fine point on this. Different utilities peak at different months, right? So PG&E territory peaks in July, and you can look at Southern California Edison system, it peaks more in September. And then when we think about how you add these curves, right? You're kind of adding their own curves and then it's gonna peak at some other time, right? So every single system has to be balanced from a transmission congestion point of view and also local reliability point of view, which is the flex capacity, right? So you're trying to balance that, you're balancing the system and you're balancing each territory with all these uncertainty.
Yeah.
One quick question, so I noticed this is at 2045, right? So
Yeah, we've got time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you predict the peak load for 2045? Like we use what kind
Yeah.
of expectations or like, cause like this is like 30 years later, right? So
Yeah, we're looking at economic growth. We get an economic forecast from Moody's Analytics. We're looking at population growth. We're looking at all the different sectors. We're looking at the transportation. We're looking at the heat pumps. So it's all those different components there that all go into a forecast that goes out to, well, in this case, it's the demand scenarios that go out to 2045. Now, there's less confidence with these, but they are scenarios that kind of say, if we run our economic models, we think that it's going to look something like this.
Yeah, and to your point earlier when we spoke, these scenarios in 2045 is not necessarily what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But it really gives you a flavor for the kinds of things that might show up.
Yeah.
Right? You might have a situation where you have a negative thing. You might have,
Yeah.
and how are you going to set up policy to make sure that doesn't happen? And also, I wanted to say this before on the data centers, right? And this goes to the trade-offs we talked about in terms of procedural equity last time, which is procedural equity is ability to be at the table when we discuss things. People with like huge monies like Microsoft or Google have a lot more access to decision-making bodies, including legislature, right? And they have better comms teams. Our best comms team is Quinton all the time, but better comms team, and they could be very persuasive in developing legislation that we might not want to have, right? Where the legislature might just say, you shall plan for 10 gigs of data centers, right? Because they got them and basically they said, CEC doesn't know what they're doing. We really need you to intervene here. And they're worried about their own their constituencies and then it happens. So it's kind of, those are the kind of things that play out, yeah.
I'm just curious about the assumptions that go into like the electrification adoption pieces, and then not to belabor it here, but do you guys release notes on the assumptions as
Yeah.
well? Could you
Yeah, we
share
have
that?
workshops, slides, documentation, all kinds of stuff. I was gonna select, I think, a small segment of reading for the IPER, but I wasn't quite sure how much light reading.
But let's kind of
versus-
think about, so if you're looking for pretty much everything that constitutes these charts, our job is to make it publicly accessible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we-
maybe after class or whatever, you could share a link that those details.
Okay,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah,
And you made an important point that you can only rely on publicly accessible information. And so that's important for us. If we want to be considered in the forecast, we should publish. It should be in journal articles, publicly available reports. If it stays unpublished, that you can't use it.
And
But have you talked about sort of what the difference is between publicly accessible and not, and why that's
Yeah.
important? Have
Yeah, a
you
little
talked
bit,
about it
yeah.
as a group?
Yeah. You could add more, but yeah, we talked.
Well, I mean, there's basically, if all the information is out there in its competitive market, it can be used in ways that are not productive, and so talk about balance
We talked
points.
about more
Yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah, right.
Even that it applies though, yeah.
But we're in this, as a public agency, we're in a constant sort of conversation, that's to put it lightly, with the Public Utilities Commission and with others about, okay, where are the IOUs data what is it that they're putting into their annual, annual rate setting? How's that all working? And there's a reason for us not having full access to it, because there are competitors. We're out in the market. We're both trying to buy resources. And likewise, we're a public agency, but there are certain parts of our data that if it went to, in sort of general, we published it, there would be a problem with that, because then it could be used in our negotiations for contracts, because that same solar developer would know what I'm willing to pay and what somebody else is willing to pay, and then they'd be able to take advantage of that from a market perspective. So there's reasons for
Absolutely.
it. But on the other hand, the balance and the trade-off is that you as regulators don't have the best available information in all regards. So it's fraught with
Yeah.
with challenges.
Definitely. And another big one, demand flexibility. It sounds great. It's nice. Here's an example. We have a demand flex tool that we have. What we can do is, remember those shapes that we're looking at, hourly demand. You can imagine if you had the right program in place, you had the right participants, you had the right technology set up and everything, that you could say, whoa, 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 things are spiking, right? At this hour. We can kick on and send a signal, right? The utility can, or the CCA can, or whoever can send a signal and say, hey, if you do this now, it will give you some kind of benefit, right? So then they pull down the demand so that the bars go down, but then you have to make it up, right? You have what's called maybe snapback, or you have recharging, other types of thing like that. So we have a tool that allows us to kind of think about how that might operate, but it is very much in the development stage at this point. But here's a way to think of it, of V to G. You got vehicles, you've got them charging at certain times, you've got some kind of, we develop a model, and the model has a theoretical discharge of power at the hour, but then we have to kind of take into account some other factors. How many EVs are at the right site, right? You're going to dinner tonight, right? Well, if you're signed up for the V2G program, you're not participating that night, right? Because you're at Arby's or wherever, right? EVs that are plugged in, maybe you get home. We know that people just like, sometimes they plug in, sometimes they don't. You know, the first 3 months you own your car, you're plugging it in every day. And then one day you're like, I'll just walk inside because I've got 250 miles still in my car. I'm not going to charge it right now, right? So how many are plugged in? How many EVs or sites are technically capable? Do you have a bi-directional charger that can go both ways, that can receive power and also send power out? And then how many people are going to sign up for the utility to say, let us control your car, right? They need to market that in the right way, right? But you might not get everybody signed up. So that's big donut that we started with, like it's getting chopped up. And this is the amount of people that are actually willing to participate in the program. And that's going to be our functional dispatch potential. That being said, this little bit of a slice, imagine, you know, whatever, 100 kilowatt hours in every driveway. The average home maybe uses 2 kilowatts, 3 kilowatts when it's kind of hot out over the course of an hour. So there's a lot of energy sitting in those batteries in driveways and in parking lots, et cetera. So there's a lot of potential here. And our tool basically shows, if we look at 2045 as the big year, EV V to X, or vehicle to grid, or vehicle to some other load, is a very large portion. We're talking gigawatts of potential here. In theory, if it were set up right, you might even be able to kill the peaker plant, in theory. Now, whether or not that's actually going to happen, we don't know. There's uncertainty. The batteries are there, but like, how do you set up the programs? How do you set up the technology, et cetera?
And you just want to make sure, like, you know, that as Quentin just mentioned, from a CAISO's perspective, who's the grid operator, right? All they're trying to do is like supply demand balance. The number one interest is performance and dependability.
Yeah.
And if they ask on a very hot day, I need 200 megawatts of demand flexibility, and people don't show up, lights go out. And so it's been, CAISO has struggled a lot to trust it, because for us, as we watch it, you cannot consistently get demand flexibility. So rates are a good way. On average, is again, I think to the discussion before, over a large number and on averages, yes, there is opportunity. But if you're like localizing it and saying, I want this to show up here for this much time, it's much harder to demand flexibility.
Yeah.
So that foreshadows, there's on Thursday, May 22nd, we won't have class.
We will have class, but.
Well, no, we won't have
But-
class.
yeah.
In the classroom will be all day at the Demand Flex Summit over at the Davis Conference Center. We're hosting the Demand Flex Summit in partnership with the Energy Commission, and there'll be a reception right around our time of our class.
We should think about involving some of you if you have time on,
Yeah.
you know.
No, you should plan to attend as much of it as you can as part of the class. Because this is, you're gonna see the trade-off in real time with policymakers, industry, all talking about whether demand flex is actually real and how real it is and how can we make it better. And then another class we're gonna have will be focused on demand flex even more so,
Yeah. Definitely.
So Valley Clean Energy happens to be one of the folks at the forefront, or one of the entities at the forefront of this demand flexibility kind of question, because we've got all that ag load and it's pretty centralized. You're working with a farmer that controls a good amount of energy. We've been able to sign up about 4 megawatts of load, and it has shown up when we've wanted, when we've expected it, because one of the superpowers of a CCA is that we can set rates without going to the PUC. Thursday, my board meeting, just that I came from, I could say to my board, hey, we need to set this rate to be able to accomplish this thing. They can say, okay, let's go ahead and do that. And it can happen almost, I wouldn't say instantaneously, we're gonna put analysis into it and that kind of thing. But point being is that we have that ability. And that's super, super important for CCAs, for the whole business model to work. And allows us to do things like load flexibility, where we're able to go in, work with the Public Utilities Commission and with PG&E to figure out how you send the right price signal at the right time, with the right incentive, with the right automation, so that that load has the best possibility of showing up and using the market to actually find that. So in Quentin's example, talked about, will you let somebody control your device? That's one model. The other model is to say,
Rates.
market.
Yeah.
If you set the right rates, you get the right incentives, will that show up? That remains to be seen, how sticky that is. But we've got some pretty decent results, I would say, over the past 3 years or so, at least in the agricultural sector.
And also large loads, right? So
Yeah, and large loads.
if you look at very large loads, somebody can turn off their business for a little while, a huge compressor for a little while. So we have about 1,000 megawatts on the system today that's called resource reliability demand response. And that 1,000 megawatts is backed by large customers. It always shows up.
Right.
When you call it, but you can't call them because you're interrupting the business. So
Because they get paid to do it.
significantly.
A lot of money, because the system, if the system goes down, that's even a bigger issue. So that's the kind of trade-off too, from a state policy. I don't want to speak for the state, but that's kind of the trade-off, right? You got to pay them to show up.
So it's right now that large customer class gets $170 a kilowatt year. So if you have a megawatt, that's 170,000. If you have 20 megawatts, that's a lot of money to stay ready to just shut down for a little while.
But that's how important that is.
That's how
Yeah.
important it is.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of opportunities. Vehicles are a big one, but then ag pumping, HVAC control, smart thermostats, these sorts of things that aren't recharging. They're just kind of avoiding, maybe shedding a little bit, maybe upping the thermostat by a degree or two. Batteries that already exist might be able to sign up to this program. Maybe you use it for your own home, but you're willing to offer a little bit of that capacity there. Maybe you get a bonus. And then there's several other things that we do as well. The final big one that's an uncertainty for the future, especially with planning for this load, is hydrogen. Siva mentioned on the order of theoretically 25 gigawatts of load to generate hydrogen with electricity. So we assess hydrogen in the forecast. There's a lot of uncertainties on the demand side. If you go back 10 years ago, people would have told you that every third car that's on the lot is going to be a hydrogen fuel cell car. on the lot. That is not happening. We're not seeing those sales. We're seeing the battery market take off in such a way that, you know, people say, well, maybe in heavy duty, medium and heavy duty, like buses and trucks. It does not appear to be manifesting itself in the way that it's making the claims. We'll see if they can get ahead, but the battery market is really taking off. So yeah, some interesting things there. And then also uncertainty on the supply side. Are people gonna produce this off grid, just sort of in the desert? Or are they gonna tie into the grid? Are we gonna get the hydrogen from biological sources? So there's a host of different uncertainties with how you're actually going to generate the hydrogen. Is the hydrogen gonna be grid tied? Is the hydrogen gonna be grid friendly or not? Maybe it's tied into the grid, maybe it's willing to participate in the demand flex program, right? So there's all kinds of uncertainties there, but we are talking about, you know, the hydrogen, are we gonna demand it? And then even if we are gonna demand it, how are we gonna supply the electricity to make it that way? So those are the big
Can I add
challenges.
two things? So just want to think about this, right? We mentioned last time that energy policy intersects with economic policy. So one of the strong cases for hydrogen is transitioning oil and gas workers. Right, it's very similar skills, pipe fitters, and they have an opportunity to say, look, you know, we have a transition plan for oil and gas. Similarly, another resource that gets a lot of that is offshore wind. Because offshore wind has these large welding, you know, pipes, and you know, you need to build those structures. So those are kind of the adjacent policy variables that might have to compute. And then if you want to go one slide, this slide, wait, this one.
Yeah.
So if it's grid tied, if hydrogen is grid tied, the grid is not the cleanest, right? It's like, as of today, it's 66% clean in California. We just got the updated numbers for 2020. So if I'm grid connected, my hydrogen molecule is quote unquote 63% clean, right? But the advantage of that is I can rate base it, right? Meaning that hydrogen load is now paying for the assets and then ensures that that is discounted for regular customers. Agreed? The numerator versus denominator, right? Like you have assets and you have amount of sales. So if you could use the existing infrastructure to, you know, include hydrogen in it, you will reduce the rates for consumers. On the other end, you know, the question is, if you keep doing that, are you creating unclean hydrogen? Right? So maybe we should just do its own little solar farm and then do hydrogen. Right? So these are the kind of aspects that kind of keep coming in, and then depending on whether you're an environmental group or justice community or state or investment community, you begin to see those trade-offs very, very differently. And that's something that you all have to grapple.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left until 8 p.m., but I just want to acknowledge something that all three of you, I'm pretty sure, went to work today at a normal hour, started your day at a normal hour. And
I did not start until 7:15 today.
okay, so a little bit of a late start.
Yeah.
And you spent the evening with us, and just I don't know, I just really appreciate your participation today. Clearly, you're going above and beyond, and I think everybody here would want to appreciate your time today. So just want to give you a big round of applause. We have 1 minute officially left.
Can I just gonna use like 3 minutes, right? And so we start the class about 3 or 4 minutes. I want to just hear from the class.
Yes.
What did you take away from this today? Like, what was helpful? What do you take away?
What is your blue sky?
Should we
140
go all in
character.
hydrogen, biogenic? That's good. No, I think it's really helpful to kind of, what resonated with you? What was like, I don't understand why we would do this crazy thing.
I mean, I love that, when you're talking about how is the state, creating the demand forecast that everybody has to use. And then we have Mitch, who's talking about how do we actually implement that and what are his considerations as running the CCA. And I mean, just having that the three of you see you speak is just, I don't know where else you could see that. So it's actually having like these negotiations and discussions here it's really cool. So learning a lot just through osmosis. At least I think so. So
Yeah, also like I'm thinking like especially like for the forecast for the demand perspective, it's like something kind of like what I've done with Unreal. So I'm always curious about like how does like CEC do the forecast, like also like how does Unreal or how does the EA do the forecast? And also the trade-off, like after we made the forecast, then like what's the situation for the policymakers, for the regulators to make the policy? And then like how does the supply side, also like how does demand side, for example, the CCI is going to doing the trade-off between different stakeholders. So I mean like today is a lot of information for me to digest, but I think it's a lot, especially like with a low demand perspective. So it's a lot. And also like, for example, when we are making the policies, right? We make the baseline and then like we make, for example, hydrogen data center or something else as like the future scenario. So yeah, this logic is really helpful. Yes.
Yeah, I think something really important that Yolis brought back was mentioning specifically all these different entities. The I guess what their best interests are also in, like the incentives they receive is also something to always keep in mind. When people, probably think, well, why did it go that route? And it's really always important to draw that well, that was kind of the bigger incentive they have, whether it was CAISO or CEC or CCA. Yeah. So.
I will just admit, like even, like I'm, as I said, I think Mitch is also a public servant, it's a nonprofit. Even though we are public servants, right, we could also be, like our incentive could be to not lose our scope, right? One of the things that I personally have to check myself is, am I losing the ability to influence? Is my lane decreasing, right? And it's a lot of you need to commit to like be okay with that. If you're not, you will end up being a problem. You should be ready to expand and you should be ready to like shrink if you're not the right vehicle for that moment of time.
I was just gonna echo what others were saying. It's, we're sort of like reviewing how interactions happen in real life and down to the mechanics, which I find very interesting because that's how things get done. But then the one question I had, which we don't have answered, but would be, from the different entities' perspectives, what's like, if you could wave a wand, what are some rules of engagement you would wish to change to make things more efficient, just from your perspective, right? It may not work, maybe you propose it, maybe it got denied, but I'd be curious, just because you're thinking about your objectives and your goals, and you probably have a direct path to get to your goal, but that maybe have barriers because of other people's roles or other entities' roles.
I think Quinton and Mitch, I think would be good to answer, and I'll answer.
It'd be nice if we had more insight into how the utilities think, because they're oriented in a certain way. They are private. They're accountable in some ways, but it's hard for us to understand some of the decisions they make and how they use the forecast. And it'd be helpful for us to understand more about how so we can make it better. They tell us what they want to see and we try to accommodate that, but we're kind of like, it's a little bit of a black box. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I wouldn't disagree with that either. I mean, it's sometimes, you're trying to read the tea leaves a lot. Sort of what motivates people and entities to do the things. I mean, I explained sort of what my perception of the incentives are and sort of how it's generally structured. That's not always the case. But what I would say, if I was able to wave a magic wand, I would say, for the next 3 years, no additional rules or regulations. Just let us try to figure out how to do what we're doing right now and just say, let's, exactly, because I mean, and again,
I would agree with that.
It's no critique of the regulators. They're trying to do their job in the best way that they can. The other thing I would say is specifically to the Public Utilities Commission, because we are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, is to develop a better working relationship with them, because what they have been used to doing for 100+ years is regulating 3 investor-owned utilities. And now the CCAs have been inserted into this, and it really does create a disruption. You've heard me say this before, my preference, my dream is to be viewed as a positive disruption rather than a negative disruption. And something that creates more and harder work for the Public Utilities Commission. I would rather that relationship be more similar to what we have with the Energy Commission. And I'm not just buttering you up right now by saying that, but it's true that it's more of a conversation, it's more of a dialogue. And that's not to say that there aren't fantastic people at the PUC trying to do the best that they can, but that relationship is more adversarial than what needs to be as a public agency communicating and trying to work with a fellow public agency and getting, I'll use the word stonewalled over and over and over again, is problematic. So if we were able to sort of wave the wand, it would be to improve that relationship. And that is happening. But just, like me, I'm impatient. Like everybody, I'm impatient.
I'm
want
too.
to see it. Want to see it happen. And it has to happen. And that's the other thing I would say, just real quickly, is the work is so critically important. We oftentimes lose perspective and sight of what really is at stake here. And that's why I'm always encouraged when I come to discussions like this, with thoughtful people who are looking and going to be a part of the future and making those decisions and trying to share with you information that could be helpful to you in some regard, because the work has to be done, and it has to be done quick, and it has to be done well. And so that's really what we as CCAs, how we view the world.
I would I think that's such a good question, like from a very deeper sense, right? I mean, I would stitch mine with both responses. If I'm going into a room, I would rather go into a room with not the idea of outmaneuvering each other constantly, like I'm gonna sketch out the next chess move, versus I'm going to just put the cards on the table of what my goals are and how we get there. And that requires kind of trust, requires kind of ability for people to be okay with just showing the cards at the start and not hiding them. And I think part of the complexity we have is we're always trying to guess what the other person is trying to do, versus just saying, look, I need, shareholder return for my investment, period. I cannot, compromise on this because I won't be investment grade, and that will be a lot of problem downstream for ratepayers. And I think those kind of conversations, because of how much judgment is kind of attached to people just speaking honestly, people are scared. People are scared of being shamed. People are scared of being litigated. So nobody says anything other than just programmed word. I mean, sometimes we write our public comments, and the original sentence will be this long and clear, and by the time I kind of end up with the comms team reviewing my public statement, it's like 16 words that make no sense. It sounds like a robot. So but that's what we did. So thank you.
Great question.
I'm gonna keep referring. Actually, the story of some people who've had some sort of operation and they have a window on their stomach and their digestion. And the scientists just love this because they can see what's actually happening inside the body. What California is kind of that window, that what they're describing here happens in every country, in every utility, in one way or another, but usually it's covered by skin and you never see it. So true, the pressures may be different and so on, but this is just such a wonderful opportunity to see everybody, all the players and their needs being played out.
This is great.
It's over 8 p.m. Can I ask a question? I know you forecast demand to make the grid reliability. And I've always been wondering, why are the US grid like ERCOT and West western interconnection are not connected via AC. Because I feel if the grid are interconnected each other, it could improve overall grid reliability and reduce the need for large reserve power.
Want to take a history lesson?
So, all right, so there's history behind that. But I'll ask you, why is Japan and Korea not connected at Kyushu?
Actually,
Which would produce some increased reliability. There's often a very strong historical aspect that doesn't have anything to do with economics. But in the case of Texas, Texas has decided it wants to remain
I mean,
isolated.
for Texas, ERCOT, I think it's very simple, right? Like the preferences of a state of Texas is to not have any federal oversight. So intrastate trading and connections, right, would bring you under FERC jurisdiction. So Federal Energy Regulatory Agency. So that's the,
Yeah.
and that's the reason why, ERCOT is kind of more isolated. But to your other point on just the design, wire some AC, wire some DC, it's part of history, right? It was like, and now we're trying to take that machination of system and try to integrate that together. And I think part of it is just remnants of historical preferences and how we built it. Not for lack of wanting to have a better interconnection. And I will share, and we will have a conversation on this in a future class. We are right now talking about the Western 11 states and provinces, right? We have about 11 in the Western Interconnect, just trading with each other under a single market. We can't agree on it because people are scared about giving their autonomy and power to another state. So, in some ways, it's not about economics and physics anymore. It's purely preferences, but it's political people preferences.
All right, I know that you've got an 8:30 call with the.
You?
You have an 8:30 call tonight, right?
Shoot,
Yeah, so, the date is not finished, but it's really cool that you're giving us your time, it's really, so,
Thanks.
listen, again, thank you. And,